Another episode of The Bad Batch is out, and it's everything we could have hoped for. Per usual, there will be spoilers for the episode in this video, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, go do so. That's an order, trooper.
The show is about to begin.
This week, our favorite squad of defective clones took a trip to Pantora, a moon we haven't seen since the good old days of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. Notably home to the blue-skinned humanoid Pantorans and George Lucas's cameo character, Pantora played a major role in a few Clone Wars episodes. When we saw it last at the height of the conflict, the moon was doing pretty well for itself despite the war, and in The Bad Batch, we got to see that it escaped the conflict intact. But dark days are ahead for Pantora. Though they didn't yet know it, those Pantorans who were cheering for the rise of the Empire were celebrating the end of their homeworld's peace and prosperity. In this video, we're going to be talking about why.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we delve into things, we need to quickly talk about Pantora's location in the galaxy. You wouldn't know it from how well off the planet is, but Pantora is in the absolute middle of nowhere, astrographically speaking, on the edge of known space. Some maps consider it wild space, out beyond the trailing sectors. The Empire classified it as being part of the Outer Rim, but on the very edge of wild space. It was the only world of its kind in about 1,000 light years. The rest of the systems in that region were mostly primitive backwaters, scum dens, and underworld havens. Keep all of this in mind because it's going to be very important later. As is easy to forget, Pantora was actually a moon, orbiting a remote ice planet called Plutonia. Aside from a primitive colony of Tals, who went undiscovered until the Clone Wars, the planet was featureless, and it was never colonized by anyone other than the Tals tribe. Pantora itself was much more pleasant, and it was home to an indigenous species of near-humans called Pantorans. The Pantorans went undiscovered by the galaxy at large for quite a long time, but they were nonetheless able to develop well enough on their own, developing space travel and a thriving civilization on their own. Pantora wasn't discovered until a few centuries before the Clone Wars, due to its remote nature. Unlike most remote worlds discovered during the Republic Golden Age, however, it integrated quite nicely with the Republic after initially making contact. It was largely dependent on the Trade Federation for contact with galactic society, like many other worlds on the Republic's fringe, but it nonetheless thrived under the Republic, becoming home to beings of many species. Its relationship with the Republic was good enough that it was granted a small unit of clones to serve as a defensive garrison during the Clone Wars, something unheard of in the far reaches of space. Pantora was very much an oddity in the galaxy. Plenty of worlds on the galactic fringe developed comparably civilized societies, but were nonetheless virtually cut off from the Republic, all but ignored by the central government. We honestly don't know why or how Pantora was an exception to this rule, but we do know that it was a tenuous balance. We saw in Star Wars: The Clone Wars how desperately the moon was reliant on the Trade Federation. When the Trade Federation blocked the world in a bid to bring it into the CIS, Pantoran society would have collapsed if more neutral-minded Trade Federation officials had not intervened to end the blockade. With the Republic turned Empire victorious in the Clone Wars, the Pantorans likely believed a new age of prosperity was upon them. Their civilization had only grown under the Republic after all, and while the threat of separatist attacks had dampened growth during the Clone Wars, things seemed sure to go back to normal with the war over. But unfortunately for them, that wasn't the case. The Empire was preparing to reshape the galaxy, and Pantora would ultimately suffer because of it. Remember how we said that Pantora was in the middle of nowhere? Well, after the end of the Clone Wars, it actually lay well beyond the borders of the Empire, even after the Empire reclaimed most of the territory the Republic had lost during the Clone Wars. Pantora had never been located in Republic space, however. It was connected to the Republic primarily through the Trade Federation and through the efforts of its more influential politicians. But with the rise of the Empire, the Trade Federation no longer existed, and its politicians no longer made much of a difference, since the Empire was essentially ruled by the military and a selection of bureaucrats. The loss of the Trade Federation would have been particularly bad for Pantora. After Newt Gunray and Rune Hako were murdered by Darth Vader and Mustafar, acting Viceroy Centipeth Findos was forced at Blaster Point to sign a treaty that transferred over the Trade Federation's assets to the Empire. The Empire proceeded to completely liquidate the Trade Federation together with most of the other corporate factions on the Separatist Council. While it absorbed all of the Trade Federation's assets, the Empire did not take over the Trade Federation's duties to systems it had agreements with, nor did it reimburse them or anything. Worlds like Pantora that had been dependent on the Trade Federation were suddenly left without incoming supplies or an easy means of re-establishing trade. In the Bad Batch, we got to see Pantora in the calm before the storm. The Empire had a bit of a presence on the moon in the episode in the form of a small detachment of clone stormtroopers, but those clones were likely on their way out the door, since the Empire didn't share the Republic's interest in maintaining a military presence on Pantora. After they had registered everyone through the chain code system, those stormtroopers probably just turned around and left. Either way, we know of no meaningful contact between Pantora and the Empire following those first few months after the war's end, in both Legends and canon. Other planets abandoned by the Empire became shadow ports, overtaken by spice kingpins, smugglers, and other underworld types. The prosperity they had once experienced was forgotten as they were overrun by what Obi-Wan Kenobi would call scum and villainy. Most of Pantora's neighboring worlds had gone that route long before the Empire, becoming hubs for the spice trade or even slaver rings. Pantora had stood in stark contrast to those shadow ports which it had long held itself to be better than, but with the rise of the Empire, it may well have ceased to be different before long. In canon, we have no information about Pantora following the rise of the Empire, but we do know a little bit from Legends. In Legends, Pantora experienced a steady decline beginning almost immediately after the end of the Clone Wars, forced to rely on mercenaries and unsavory types just to get information and resources. It was completely cut off from the galaxy at large due to the Empire's policy of maintaining a hard border against what it considered wild space. In all likelihood, Pantora's distinctions from its neighboring scum dens were likely forgotten or ignored by Imperial bureaucrats, who saw its whole region as a crime-filled patch of wild space. As a rule, the Empire only cared about those regions when planets there had valuable resources to exploit, which Pantora generally lacked, or when there were remote systems there it could perform superweapon tests on, for which Pantora was much too heavily populated. The Pantorans were divided on how to survive this crisis. Some advocated for sucking up to the Empire. They wanted to appease the New Order as much as humanly possible in the hopes that the Empire would notice them and maybe allow them to integrate properly back into galactic society. Some others opposed the Empire and wished to reshape Pantora into an independent republic. However, that faction lacked an answer for how to get the resources to do so. Still, others presented what most Pantorans saw as the worst option of all, allying with the spice worlds and slaver hubs around them, which they hoped would allow them to get the resources they desperately needed. Now, Legends never actually tells us what route the Pantorans went with, but considering that Pantora all but faded out of existence during the time of the Empire, we think it's a fair bet that the last faction won out. That was, after all, the only path Pantora could have realistically taken. While that's all Legends, Pantora could have had to face those three options in canon as well, and we'd bet that, once again, the criminal element would prevail. In The Mandalorian, we saw how much of the Outer Rim had been left to its own devices, even once the New Republic triumphed. Virtually all of the planets we got to see on the Rim in that period had been taken over either by criminal elements or by local warlords, and that was after just 6 years of isolation. Pantora had over 20 years of isolation under the Empire, and those years wouldn't have been too kind to it. As those Pantorans cheered on the rise of the Empire in the latest Bad Batch episode, they were headed for a long, dark age. So that's the fate that awaits Pantora following the events of the latest Bad Batch episode. But what do you think? Were you happy to see Pantora again in this episode? Did you forget it even existed? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.